Thanks, Mary Lou, and welcome. We're so glad you're here. As Mary Lou said, I'm Sarah, and I live actually across the street. So I do spend a lot of time at the library, and I live in a house that was built in the 1800s, and a man who lived there 100 years ago was the first president of this library. So there's some long connection between that house and this building. And I think it's fair to say that all roads lead to Kennebunkport, and in this case, they lead to our two Davids, who we're going to hear today. And I don't know if you guys want to sit down yet or wait, but you can wait for your entrance. And so David Rohde, of course, has a long connection to Maine. He's a Mainer. He went to Freiburg Academy, and his wife Kristen and Mary Jane from Goose Rocks. And we're grateful that your family's here, Julia and Ella, I'm glad, and stepmother Andrea. And then David Maraniss, who will be interviewing him, is my dad. So his connection to Kennebunkport started about 5 years ago when we moved here. My husband is a Mainer as well. So we're so glad that we have these two extraordinary journalists here to discuss this new book of David's, Where Tyranny Begins. And David, of course, is currently NBC News national security editor. And before that was the executive editor of the New Yorker's website. My dad, David Maraniss, is associate editor at the Washington Post and also an author, written a lot of biographies on presidents. You may have seen him at the River Club 2 years ago, I think it was 2, when he discussed his biography on Jim Thorpe. I just want to put in context, though, for today, what I think is so interesting is that David Rohde hasn't just reported internationally about governments and countries that are undergoing threats to democracy. He's really put his own well-being in peril, or perhaps as a consequence of those regimes. And so this isn't just kind of a theoretical discussion of what happens where tyranny or when tyranny begins. But I think in many ways he has firsthand experience. So with that said, let's welcome our Davids.
Thank you, daughter. I don't get to say that often. And thank you all for coming here. I love libraries, and this library is spectacular. It's now become my favorite library of all. And David, we've both been journalists for a long time, but this is the first time I've had the honor of meeting you. And I would welcome you to Kennebunkport, but actually you're much more of a Mainer than I am. So
no, I'm not a real Mainer. I wasn't born here, so it doesn't really count.
Yeah, but you come here, and I've just been starting to come here. And anyway, I'm delighted to have a conversation with you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I had sort of hoped, perhaps like many, if not, but not all of the people in this room, that this would be a discussion about history, something that happened, as opposed to also a discussion about the future and what might happen next. So I thought that we could start, before we get to the book itself, talk about where we are at this point. The title of this book, Where Tyranny Begins, comes from 4 centuries ago, from John Locke. Wherever law ends, tyranny begins. And David has spent so many years studying the law in the United States and around the world, and what it means, and we're at that point where the question is as relevant as ever. So I think I would love to start with you sort of describing what you think the Trump restoration will bring in challenges to the law, even more so than the first term.
Thank you for having me here. And if I can just take a minute, and I was thrilled that actually we recognize the veterans. My brother's a veteran, and my uncle and others. But I want to recognize these veterans right here, as was mentioned earlier by Sarah. And she made I digress, I apologize.
No,
but
no,
I'm particularly
great.
nervous because you're all Mainers, and my entire family is here. So, and they're all incredibly tough, badass women. But anyway, so my stepmother, Andrea Rohde, who's been an incredible part of my life forever, Mary Jane Mulvihill, my mother-in-law, my daughter Ella, who's a freshman in high school, my daughter Julia, who's in 5th grade, and my wife, Kristen. And I'm doing this, you sort of made an opaque reference to it, and we'll talk about it, but, you know, and sorry, Tom and Eileen, my in-law, my aunt and uncle in-law, also Mulvihills, also Goose Rocks people, Biddeford folks. So anyway, yes, I covered a bunch of wars, and one of the things I've done in those periods is seen the dangers of, I've seen Civil War and how it unfolds and how people become so committed to a cause that they commit violence. And then I was arrested at one point during the war in Bosnia by the Bosnian Serbs after I discovered some mass graves there of victims they had killed who were Bosnian Muslims. And then I was held by the Taliban, as some of you may know, now 15 years ago. But I'm so grateful to these people for standing by me. Chris and I just got married when I was kidnapped by the Taliban, and she spent 7 months with Mary Jane and Andrea and many others helping me. So I want to thank you. So there's another brother-in-law. I have a brother-in-law. Anyway, there's running jokes about who is the worst son-in-law to Mary Jane. I like getting kidnapped by the Taliban a month after you marry someone's daughter. Not a good move. Anyway, we're very lucky, and I'm grateful to be here. And I'll say, too, and it reminded me of the veterans thing, and we were talking downstairs and what's happening, and many people are afraid, many people are thrilled. My simple answer, and David, I should have said this downstairs, is, you know, this book and what I do is that I think we live in a hyper-partisan era where we're deeply divided and we can't agree on basic facts. But where I'm going to go personally is that I think what we need more than ever is nonpartisan public service in this country. Some people, election clerks who count votes fairly and accurately, that happened. I mean, you know, this past week, it's sort of a miracle that we have these elections and you know, that worked. Judges who also, you know, decide cases hopefully in fair and fact-based ways, and journalists who are sort of doing their best to present, you know, events as accurately as they can. So I'm at NBC News. We have a website which is growing and growing, and we have the marquee show is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. So I'm a Lester Holt guy. I like, you know, it's kind of boring. Sorry. It's not as cool as Joe Rogan, who I think may have decided the election.
Not in this crowd.
But yeah, exactly. But so I'm not. I'll talk about what's happening and a lot of these loud voices and what they're talking about doing once Trump takes office. But and maybe I'm naive, but I really believe that. So I'm committed. I lead the National Security Unit. It's a National Security and Legal Unit, so it's people covering the Supreme Court, the Justice Department, the Pentagon, the CIA. But we all talked, and we're going to try to, you know, carry out fact-based journalism for the next 4 years. There's conversations going on inside NBC News that, like, being the resistance and, you know, having, like, our White House correspondent sort of constantly fighting with Trump isn't what we want to do. That we want to kind of stick to the basics of journalism.
Well, in 2016, when Donald Trump was first elected, our editor, Marty Barron, said, "We're not at war, we're at work."
Yes. And and look, he won the election, and many people supported him. My mother-in-law here I mean this, we have family conversations about it all the time, and he now has a mandate from the people to carry out, you know, the policies he campaigned on. The flip side of that, and this is a story I edited last night by a colleague of mine, Ken Delaney, and it's one of the main things one of the things he talked about in the campaign was prosecuting his enemies. You know, he had the 2 federal cases against him. They were brought by Jack Smith, the special prosecutor. One was for keeping the classified documents in Mar-a-Lago that the National Archives asked back for about a year. And then in my view, there's very clear evidence of that. And I talked to many of the people who were involved in that case. And then the January 6th case. So it's amazing. There are characters in this book who I interviewed, who the real firebrands, the lawyers around Trump, are saying that they want to put Jack Smith on trial. The FBI agents who I got to know and the prosecutors who I interviewed for this book, I'm not going to name them, they could be put on trial, you know, by the new administration for bringing this case against Donald Trump about the classified documents. And this is, I'll be honest with you, there's a guy named Mike Davis. He's this very outspoken lawyer, very pro-Trump, and that's absolutely fine. But one of the chapters of the book are about different strategies that they used, and a lot of what Trump does is sort of troll liberals, older folks, getting them all riled up and wanting to dominate the news cycle. And so there's a form of practicing law, that's a chapter in the book called LOL, like laugh out loud. I had to have Ella explain that to me. LOL, nothing matters lawyering. And it's a reference to this idea that, when Trump came in, he did this sort of with the travel ban, and that you use the courts to kind of get your message out in terms of the communications. You use the courts to own the libs, to get them, really angry, and you use the courts to kind of make yourself look good to Trump. And say what you want, he's a messaging savant. Like, he dominates the news. And so this guy just yesterday, Mike Davis, he's calling for Jack Smith, the special counsel, and New York Attorney General Letitia James to be prosecuted. She brought the civil suit against Trump. And so he said, and he's a very nice guy. My colleague, Ken Delanian, who wrote the story, knows him, and he's very polite on the phone and all this stuff, but he has an almost persona in public. And I'm just sharing this to kind of be honest and talk about our politics today. So he said on a podcast by this right-wing influencer who was talking about Letitia James, I dare you to try to continue your lawfare against President Trump. Lawfare is this term about using the law for warfare. And then she said, he's talking about Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York State. Listen here, sweetheart, addressing her. We're not messing around this time. We will put your fat ass in prison for conspiracy against rights. I promise you that. So where am I going? There's a lot of noise right now. I don't know and I'll stop. I'm not sure what the specific charge is that he can bring against Letitia James.
And who is Mike Davis, and where would he be in the new administration?
He's a better journalist. That's the facts. That always helps, the facts. He was a former congressional aide for a long time. He's not seeking a position in the Justice Department, but he's part of the Trump transition team for the Justice Department. But he's very good at this messaging and this kind of getting everybody's, blood boiling. And then he said he said in an interview with my colleague yesterday that he said all these things about Letitia James. He said, I wanted to send a very powerful political message. The American people delivered their verdict on Tuesday. And this lawfare, they see it as this unfair, prosecutions against Trump,
which is
must end. Well, that's the problem, is that you never have had this before in American history, where no one liked special counsels. I want to, of course, interview you. In terms of the Clintons and Ken Starr, a special counsel is supposed to be this is back to nonpartisan public service, that there are public health experts and meteorologists who can sort of, I don't like being political, I don't, and people who thrive at that, but you have this situation where you investigated my guy, we're going to prosecute you now. And Democrats hated Ken Starr. Republicans, George H.W. Bush, an amazing resident of this town, hated Lawrence Walsh, excuse me, the special counsel for Iran-Contra, but no one tried to prosecute either one of them. So so I don't know if this is all talk or,
Well, that's the question. What do you think?
I think that
LOL, nothing matters is just talk, or are we going to see more action this time because they didn't really were able to follow through the first time?
we had someone say that there's a battle going on, and this is pejorative, and one of the reasons Trump won is it sounds like we're sneering at them, but that there's a battle inside the Trump Justice Department transition team between the normies and the freaks. And that's not fair in terms of the freaks. But part of the book, too, is Bill Barr. Bill Barr didn't really talk to me very much.
Right.
He said, you're a left-wing radical, you write for the New Yorker. So Bill Barr gave a big speech about this, and just another. So we need more nonpartisan public service. I don't know how this is going to play out, but there is a cadre that Bill Barr, for decades, he sees the presidency as the most important branch of government, and that this giant country needs a strong presidency to survive. That the presidency, if you look at American history, has helped us when there was civil war, foreign threats, natural disasters. And he and many other conservatives have seen the post-Watergate reforms, where you have independent special counsels, where you have an independent Justice Department, where you have a War Powers Act, as weakening the power of the presidency. And so Barr supports, the president having the power to tell the Attorney General, go investigate this person. It's not to liberals, it's like this shocking, crazy thing that you have the president picking who gets prosecuted. To Bill Barr, that's the way the presidency should run.
But I'm going to keep pushing you,
Yes.
because Bill Barr was eventually fired by Donald Trump.
And this is the...
And so even he is not where they're at right now.
And here's the conundrum and the danger, I guess, of our tribalism. So he did the right thing. Like in 2020, Bill Barr said, Mr. President, this election was not stolen. The facts don't show that. And he was fired because he did that. But he also, a couple months before the election, he endorsed Trump over Kamala Harris because he feels that the leftist agenda will do more to destroy the country. He said something like, voting for Trump is Russian roulette, meaning there's one chamber in the round and you don't know what's going to happen. Voting for Harris or Biden is, the gun's loaded with all bullets. I just say that because it was fascinating in working on the book Bill Barr's not sitting around thinking, I want to destroy democracy. Thinks he's saving it, that both sides think they're saving it. And so these far-right people, I guess, really, one of the tweets, a guy who's wants to be Attorney General, accused Jack Smith of just inventing crimes against President Trump. Mark Paoletta, he's another sort of firebrand person, but he's in the running to be Attorney General. A couple other names that are out there are Eric Schmidt, a senator from Missouri, Mike Lee, another senator, John Ratcliffe, the former director of national intelligence. And so it's critical who's chosen for this. And, is it someone who really, is going to, carry out these, and Barr looked at some of the Hunter Biden stuff, appointed a Hunter Biden special prosecutor, and Hunter Biden has been prosecuted. He has been convicted on the gun charges. He has pled guilty to the tax charges. And so is it someone who sort of will look at the facts and say there's not enough evidence here to put Mark Zuckerberg on trial for, somehow, shifting the view on the right is that Zuckerberg suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop information in the spring of 2020 and therefore it shifted the outcome of the entire election. So there's people who believe that, and it was intentional, it was a crime, and then there's other conservatives and Republicans. One person I was mentioning who I think would look at that and say there's not enough evidence here for bringing somebody on a.
Well, I think we've seen every one of those billionaires sort of try to make up with Trump in the last week.
Yes.
But let's go to one more part about the future, which is there were 4 different sets of indictments against Trump and the administration. One has already been thrown out, and that clearly will never come back, right? The documents case at this point. Jack Smith, has he announced that he's dropping it, or what do you expect to happen next with the January 6th case?
There's a long-standing, this again came out of Watergate. All of this comes out of Watergate. John Mitchell, Richard Nixon's attorney general, using the Justice Department to prosecute and investigate the president's enemies. And after Watergate, again, this is the norm for 50 years, Republicans and Democratic presidents, that the president has a mandate, can come in and say, Justice Department, I want you to crack down on drugs. I want you to crack down on human trafficking. But the president never gets involved in individual criminal cases. That is what Nixon did, and that will lead to corruption and abuses. And all of that has just ended in this remarkable 6-month period with the Supreme Court's immunity decision, which I think, John Roberts and Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas thought was like saving the presidency. What Bill Barr talked about, that you have to have this strong executive whose conversations with the attorney general are, that's what they said in the decision, are absolutely immune from criminal investigation. So now Joe Biden could do it today, but Donald Trump can call up his attorney general and say, I want you to go investigate Tony Fauci. And we talked about this earlier. There are some checks that will make it hard to actually carry that out. And I just worry.
But I'm talking about the other side of it. Not who is going to go after.
Yes.
But what's going to happen to the ones that are already there.
The existing ones, sorry. He's a good interviewer. So one of the norms that, came out of Watergate was that a sitting president cannot be prosecuted by the federal government, by a state government, by a city government. And the idea was that, and it sort of makes sense, in that you don't want a sitting president being indicted. You don't want Joe Biden indicted by the attorney general in Texas. You could easily have blue and red states attacking a president and putting them on trial. And so that's been the norm since Watergate for 50 years. So it's incredible what Trump has done. It's an extraordinary political victory. It is one of the most amazing political comebacks in American history. So by winning this election and by becoming the sitting president, and Jack Smith signaled this privately to my colleagues and others, he is withdrawing the documents case and withdrawing the January 6th case.
And will he present a report that will be?
He will probably present a report to get his information out. And Republicans are already talking about, both putting Jack Smith on trial and having endless hearings where they're going to look at everything he did. Again, I know these people who conducted the Mar-a-Lago raid. It's the beginning section of the book.
Yeah.
They could all go on trial for searching Mar-a-Lago. They had a judge's order to go search Mar-a-Lago. We can talk about that in more detail. And then in terms of the New York case, I think that the state judge will delay the sentencing. And this is true. Like a president, you can't have a state judge trying to put the sitting president in jail. It just leads to chaos. And then the Georgia case is a morass, but it's the same thing. So by winning the election,
he's pretty
for
much
at least
taken care of
4
all of
years,
this.
he's taken care of.
Yeah.
Elections have consequences. And a huge number of people think none of these cases should have been brought, rightly or wrongly, but they think they're lawfare. They're invented things to smear him. And I'll keep talking about perspectives and how these are two realities. So either Donald Trump is a criminal who's got these 4 charged cases against him and is incredibly dangerous.
Convicted.
Yes, or he's a victim of this leftist courts smearing him and coming up with all these things. And tens of millions of Americans say that. I say this in the book and we can talk more. I think there was a view that prosecuting him among liberals, and bluntly on MSNBC, it's like a sister network of ours, and I work with many people there, but that there was a view that indicting Trump was going to be like a political silver bullet. And that would just, and instead it did the opposite. It helped him. His numbers soared, and he won the more he was indicted, the better he did in the Republican primaries. So the way, again, public service, and Jamie Raskin, the Democratic member of Congress, I'm sorry to jump around, I'm trying to find threads of optimism here. Public service. But Raskin said to me, he was working on the January 6th committee at the time, he's like, we want to bring out all the facts about January 6th, but Raskin said to me, but we have to win this politically. Mm-hmm. And that the most sort of, effective way, if you oppose Trump, is to beat him in an election. Guess what?
Didn't happen.
He won.
Yes. So we'll go to the book now.
Sorry.
And no, that's very important. And the book is the context for all of
Yes.
that. So, but my reading of the book is it's pretty obvious. There are two central threads to the book. And it deals with 7 years, the first 4 years of the Trump administration. I mean, the 4 years of Trump, and the first 3 years plus maybe of the Biden administration. And the first part of the book is about the ways that Donald Trump effectively beat down the Justice Department and the FBI. And the second part is about how the Biden administration was slow in dealing with all of everything that dealt with Trump. When did you start reporting this book? Or at what point? And what was your expectation when you started versus?
I was gonna, people can write down questions, but my daughters were gonna ask a question, which was, why, Dad, did this take you so long? I actually got the book contract in the middle of the pandemic when we were living on Goose Rocks Beach. And my publisher came to me. It's very nice, the previous book, In Deep, which is about, is there a deep state or not?
Yeah.
I don't think there is. I think most
Right.
school teachers and police officers are, trying to do the right thing. Most government servants don't make much money. That maybe they're, they got too many benefits, and there are corrupt people in every sphere. And then my publisher had this idea. So it took 3 years, endless weekends and nights that shortened my time with them, and
So
it was very hard.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question is you started it after the Trump administration.
Yes, under Biden.
And so when you went back into those 4 years, did you already have the thesis that probably the FBI and Justice Department were beat down more than people thought, or was that something you discovered as you were doing the reporting?
I was naive, and I thought, there'll be all these people who worked in the Justice Department and FBI who'll just go on the record and tell me about their experience. They're not. Lawyers are very cautious people, no offense to any lawyers, particularly government lawyers. I mean, the Justice Department is full of kind of Ivy League law school graduates, and in Washington also, discretion is sort of the coin of the realm. So I had a very hard time getting people to talk on the record. But when I did get them to talk, it was because they feared retribution from Trump. There's a former FBI official who was very involved in the Mar-a-Lago search, who I haven't named and won't name, but he was afraid, he's out of the FBI now, that if he said anything, on the record in the book, it would destroy his current career. And a lot of people felt that way. And what we're going to see looking forward is so the president has absolute immunity when he tells the attorney general, go investigate this person or this company, but the prosecutor who does that and the FBI agent that goes out to carry out the investigation doesn't have absolute immunity. And again, a post-Watergate norm, and look, there's been terrible abuses by law enforcement in this country, towards race and many other things. You are barred under FBI rules and DOJ rules. You cannot bring a prosecution or a case without probable cause that someone committed a crime. You can't. It's abusive. Indicting someone smears their reputation, And so you might have large numbers of prosecutors refusing to carry out these cases. They'll be fired, they'll be vilified, and I don't want to scare everybody here, but there's Schedule F, you know what I'm talking about? You're more of a Washington. So one other thing and this is the deep state. Again, Trump and Steve Bannon saying that there's all these people plotting in basements to get him in Washington. And one other thing Trump has proposed is that, and there are very strong labor unions, there's rules where government servants aren't supposed to be partisan, and Schedule F was a thing that, an executive order that Trump signed just before he left office. They're currently, presidents appoint there's about 3 million federal workers, about 4,000 of them are political appointees. Trump would change the entire system and make 50,000 government workers appointed by the president, appointed by him. And now it's very hard to fire a federal worker, which leads to waste and all these complaints about bureaucracy. But it goes back to and the reason this whole modern apolitical professional civil service was created was to get away from Tammany Hall and hiring loyalists and that whole system. And a century later, Trump is saying, these bureaucrats are all liberals and they will not carry out the mandate I have from the American people. So I need to change these rules, and one of his proposals, make 50,000 of them hired and fired by Trump himself.
So it's a revenge against Grover Cleveland, basically.
Yes. But look,
Well,
if these people were, preventing Barack Obama or Joe Biden from carrying out their agendas, then, again, we've become so tribal. I did not find, though, that all these federal workers are somehow scheming to stop an elected president. They work for Republicans and Democrats. They, are they enjoy public service.
So LOL, nothing matters. Trump becomes president in 2017, and the first thing he does is sort of say, I don't care about what the Justice Department says with the Muslim ban. Tell us about that.
So it's this first thing, it's the Muslim ban, and he just presents it from the White House without letting any of the lawyers in the Justice Department even see it beforehand. And it's an early indication of, again, this strategy of it dominates the news cycle, it fires up your base, it infuriates liberals, and it's, again, using the courts, and this is sort of a Roy Cohn thing, this famous or infamous lawyer, and that's a tactic Trump used. And so some people in the Justice Department, Sally Yates, famously, she's the acting Attorney General, and it's interesting because this, again, and I believe this, a democratically elected president a government official should carry out the orders of a democratically elected president if they are lawful and they are ethical, because the power should go with the democratically elected person. Sally Yates could have resigned when the travel ban came through, but she actually ordered all the people in the Justice Department to not defend it, and that actually upset a lot of people in the Justice Department, because you shouldn't have an unelected person ordering people to not carry out the president's orders. Again, if it was reversed politically, there would be that thing, or that would frustrate people. A main character in the book is a guy named Jody Hunt,
Yes.
Who is a career worker. He's from Alabama, and he sees the travel ban as like a sign, and he just thinks that Trump is naive. Basically, Hunt believed, and he stays in the Justice Department, he doesn't quit, because he thought that the presidency would change Trump. And what happened was that Trump changed the presidency.
And he was already in the Justice Department, but became the first Attorney General's top guy.
Yes,
right?
he was Jeff Sessions' chief of staff. And he, he was pretty, he had worked for, come in the 90s, worked in the Clinton administration, George W. Bush and Obama, and he got an opportunity to be the chief of staff to Jeff Sessions.
Well, let's take him. He's an interesting way to see the arc from going in, being a little bit, thinking Trump is just naive. Take us through those 4 years with Jody Hunt. Because it really tells the story.
And this is what's going to happen right now. That there are tens of thousands of government workers that are going to come in and that's the tip of the spear, is will they carry out these things? And They don't make much money, and one of the things I realized was the revocation of Annie McCabe's pension. He was the deputy FBI director, had a huge impact on the amount of fear it created in the federal workforce, because they have really not made much money their whole lives, and they're depending on those pensions. So Jody hangs out with Jeff Sessions. I had my favorite parts of the book is that I went down to Alabama and spent an afternoon with Jeff Sessions and his wife. They gave me a really nice lunch with beautiful sort of pink lemonade, and like honestly couldn't have been nicer. And I can talk more about Sessions. But what happens is the FBI investigation of Trump and Russia had already started. So one of the first days when Jeff Sessions becomes Attorney General, he's told, we have to tell you, Mr. Attorney General, about this investigation. And Jody Hunt is sitting there. And a lot of liberals hate Jeff Sessions, but he was a former federal prosecutor himself, Jeff Sessions, earlier. And they say, Mr. Sessions, there's an investigation the FBI has opened of the Trump campaign. And Sessions goes, whoa, 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 stop talking right now. Stop talking. I don't want to know about this. Because he's there is a whole culture inside the Justice Department of conflicts of interest. And he says, I have a conflict of interest. I was a senior official in that campaign. I am recusing myself. I cannot oversee the investigation of a campaign I helped run. And it was like a no-brainer to everybody in the Justice Department. You all know this. It absolutely infuriates Trump.
Right.
And Trump spends the next 2 years privately and publicly just belittling and humiliating and politically destroying Jeff Sessions. And Jody Hunt, the reason we know, my sweet daughters, the reason we know that there's this moment where Trump's in the Oval Office, and it's in the Mueller report, but
What are you about to swear?
yes.
Okay.
When Trump is told that a special counsel, Robert Mueller, has been named,
Right.
in the Trump-Russia investigation, he slumps in his chair in the Oval Office and says, "I'm effed." That's because Jody Hunt, at night after these Oval Office meetings, would go home and write down all these notes about what happened, and he handed those over to the Mueller report. So when he watches Trump just bulldoze Sessions and then eventually force him out, and that causes him to turn on Trump. And then the final straw is
But he stayed.
he stays through that because he really believes in the Justice Department. And then the final straw is John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, wrote a book about his time in the administration. And Jody always worked in the civil division. And so this case where they tried to stop the publication of Bolton's book came in, and he was asked to sign off on it. And he just said he couldn't do it, that this was such a clear, effort to use the power of the Justice Department. They said there were national security secrets in it, and there wasn't. And so he resigned. And then the irony and the arc here is that if you watch the January 6th hearings, and you'll remember Cassidy Hutchinson, the young aide who comes in and testifies, sitting right behind her is Jody Hunt. He became her lawyer. And Cassidy Hutchinson did an interview at NBC, and I went up to her. I was like, it was in the building. But I kind of said, I know this guy, Jody Hunt. And she's like, Jody, oh, you're David. And so she actually, and I'm sorry, I guess this sounds too political, but she took a selfie of Cassidy Hutchinson, took a selfie of us and sent it to Jody. But and he is heartbroken. I talked to him a couple nights ago. He says that the institutions of government have been undermined in recent years by all the exaggerated attacks on the DOJ and FBI. This distrust in government is not grounded in reality. It's really a consequence of the rhetoric from politicians who, for their own political purposes, fuel the distrust in government. And so that's what scares me. That's why I said that part about we need the answer to this hyperpartisanship is more nonpartisan public service, more Jody Hunts.
Let's get to the Russia investigation. How did you fit that, the FBI and the Justice Department roles in that, into the notion of them getting beaten down over the 4 years?
So and it's fascinating because I would talk to people who worked for Trump, and this is honestly more politically diverse than I think New York, but people who worked for Trump laughed at this idea that he was somehow a Russian agent. They just thought it was ridiculous. they're like, there's no way he would ever collude. I mean, they thought it was, and this is why they would say it's Trump derangement syndrome, that all these people on the left take this really seriously. And I was like, no, I was one of those journalists running around. We had the dossier. I worked at Reuters at that point, and again, I'm proud of this journalism. We did not print a word of the dossier. We tried to verify it. I've told my late father-in-law Jim this story. I interviewed John Brennan, the director of the CIA. It was near the end of the 2016 campaign. All journalists had the dossier, and my daughter, and so I knew about like these P tapes.
Well, your daughter had it?
No. Oh. This is inappropriate talk here. Anyway.
Oh, I see, okay.
And so I was sitting I was doing a story about the CIA, I was working for Reuters, and this was before the election in 2016, and I said to Brennan, and it's the CIA headquarters. He's up on this floor, and it's this beautiful green canopy out the window in Langley, Virginia, and there's a couple press aides sitting there, and I said, I'm asking you off the record, and I was like, look, I don't mean to surprise you, Mr. Brennan, but do you know anything about this tape of, candidate at that point, Trump, and like prostitutes in a hotel room in Moscow? And he went, and I swear, and we talked about it at length with my in-laws, he said, I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm not going to comment either way if that tape exists or not. And I swear to God, John Brennan said this to me weeks before the 2016 election. He said, whatever you do in the next few weeks, you're going to hear all this crazy stuff about Hillary Clinton. Only write about what you know for sure. And you're going to hear all this crazy stuff about Donald Trump. Only write about what you know for sure. And so that was my personal experience. BuzzFeed published the whole dossier. Our job as journalists is to vet information before we present it to you. And I thought that was like a huge journalistic mistake. The point of all this is that I watched and lived this sort of spinning out of control. And I think Trump, and then I spent a lot of time with, and I'm digressing a bit, but.
You're good at that.
Well, I spent it all became in Trump's mind an effort to smear him.
Right.
And the sort of spy chiefs who briefed him on the dossier after he won the election, they were trying to warn him. Comey did this, and Jim Clapper. And I spent a lot of time with Jim Clapper. And it's this tribalized politics where, people are convinced that John Brennan was out. Republicans are convinced that John Brennan was like spreading the dossier. He did the opposite to me.
But the dossier is just one small part of, it became the thing.
It leads to the Russia investigation.
But the Russia investigation is so much more than that.
Because the FBI feared that Trump was a Russian agent. They did take it seriously. Journalists, partly out of ambition, and so writing the book, it was fascinating to meet with all these people who worked in the Justice Department under Trump and were conservatives, and they were like, this is silly. And I was like, no, we really were worried that he was a Russian agent. And part of it's ambition. My God, you're going to expose this president who was a Russian agent. But that's how, divided we are.
Yeah, but that would have been the ultimate part of the story. But
Yes.
But the Russian interference and involvement in the
Yes.
election was a big thing, and it was real.
It was real.
Right.
And then again, I think Robert Mueller, again, nonpartisan public service.
Right.
He concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to file a criminal case showing that the Trump campaign coordinated with Russia, that they were very open to help from Russia and they would get information that they thought would help them, but it didn't reach the bar of like, the word collusion is used. It's not there is no charge for collusion, but, and maybe I'm, again, too moderate, but so the Mueller report comes out, Barr spins the whole thing, and there's the whole obstruction of justice argument, but some liberals didn't accept Mueller's finding that there wasn't a conspiracy, that Trump didn't, maybe he got away with it, but there just wasn't evidence of it. And you have to accept that. And there's not, and so it's just, it gets into this tribalism.
Sure.
So,
Let's move on then. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So one of the most powerful parts of the book involves what essentially was an attempted coup in the Justice Department as the election is, January 6th is about to happen. with Jeffrey Clark, who was a low-level or mid-level
Yeah.
member there. And it showed the real bravery of several key members of that department. Can you tell us that story as you reported it?
It's again, Bill Barr said there's no evidence of systemic vote fraud. Jeff Clark comes in as the acting attorney general, and Jeffrey Rosen comes in, and Jeffrey Rosen and a half dozen other, and these are diehard conservatives who support Trump's agenda, all these overturn of Roe, all this stuff. But these 6 senior officials, they're the top officials in the Justice Department, agree to threaten to resign because they care so much about public trust in the Justice Department that they're not going to let this crazy mid-level guy, Jeff Clark, come in. And he was ready to start an investigation of voter fraud in Georgia in 2020. And they all said, we were going to resign, President Trump, and it worked. It was heroic. They stood for the rule of law. And you may disagree with them politically. I respect all of them very much. Rich Donahue, Jeff Rosen, a guy named Makan Del Rahim, who ran the antitrust division, the head of the national security division, did it as well. And it worked. And they decided, though, that they didn't want to make it public, because in doing so, they would be poking the bear, and Trump might do something really irrational. Of course, January 6th happened 3 days later. So I'm trying to, again, there are people doing the right things, in the Trump administration who were trying to,
And Jeffrey Clark had plotted this with Trump and Giuliani, was it? Or?
But he's reading, and he's reading all this right-wing stuff online on social media, which isn't vetted, and he believed it all about the voter fraud.
Right.
And again, a positive thing in the 2020 election, dozens of judges, Republicans and Democrats, Trump appointees, rejected all the claims of voter fraud, and the Supreme Court did. And, still though, and we can have a whole thing about the crisis of information in the country, many people just didn't believe that. They don't trust those judges. But I was very impressed that there were many Justice Department officials and even judges appointed by Trump who said, no, we stand by fact, and we're not going to let you do this.
And that gets us back to the beginning of the discussion. Will that happen again?
And that's what's going to, that's what's going to happen right now.
Yes.
He's threatened to sue or prosecute people over 100 times. There's dozens of people. There's the politicians. There's Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton.
Pelosi and Schiff.
And then there's corrupt officials he talked about in the CDC. And then it's Mark Zuckerberg, Google. He wants to criminally investigate Google because it was bringing up negative search terms about him. And it's sort of unprecedented to have a president talking about investigating so many different places. And is it a shtick? A lot of, or is he really serious about doing this?
Mm-hmm. So then we get to the Biden administration and Merrick Garland. First describe, from your perspective, Merrick Garland. He is
a complete believer in the Justice Department and completely honest person who thinks that if his whole belief was that if the Justice Department under Biden sort of followed its procedures, it would automatically restore public faith in the Justice Department. That was naive. That he gives speeches, but he's just getting demolished on X and Twitter. He's getting demolished on cable news at night. And he sat back, and then he was also very cautious about investigating Trump because he didn't want to make legal errors, that he knew that everything they did would come under a microscope. So he was essentially too cautious, sort of naive about the need to get out there and message. Just one little anecdote on Mar-a-Lago. There are younger people in the department and the FBI who want to be more, who are like, I'm looking at quotes from some of my favorite characters in the book, but basically there's the senior FBI official who's very afraid of being named. He said the FBI has to be more transparent about how it works because otherwise it's just going to get smeared and attacked and called Gestapo. And he was one of the people that argued, and they did this for the first time in the documents case. They put pictures in the court documents. So that picture, the famous picture of the top secret
Right.
documents on the carpet with all the flowers, the stacks of top secret documents in the bathroom. And that was a way you evolve your strategy. You know, you don't say, we will make our case in court 6 months from now. No, you you read your court documents, or you make things public. So that was one step forward where they were trying to push back. But again, this was all written in the wake of the election.
Right, it doesn't.
It didn't work.
Yes, exactly.
You know. And just the last thing on Garland, it's just, it's all changed, or not. He believes in the rule of law, and some of you may know this, but he's Jewish. His grandmother escaped Europe during the Holocaust, and he's this very quiet, person. And the only time he gets emotional is when he talks about his family and the role of the United States. So Merrick Garland, because of his grandmother fleeing, being able to come to the United States, he feels that his existence is possible because of the rule of law in the United States. That she could come here, she probably faced discrimination as a Jew, there's no question, but she wouldn't be hauled off to a death camp and killed. So he said, he's told aides, I sort of pushed very hard on this question. I was like, I said, while you abide by all these rules and you're never going to speak politically and you're always going to do the right thing, you're like battling Trump and you sort of have one hand tied behind your back. And, Garland has told aides, yes, the Justice Department has a hand tied behind its back compared to a political actor. But Garland said he will never allow the Justice Department to become a political actor. We would not want to be a political actor. Garland has told aides that is the end of the rule of law. And so we talked about this problem of some people are following these rules and others aren't.
Sure.
And how do you respond to that? And my answer is I'm going to keep doing my rule-following journalism.
Yeah, it's true in journalism, it's true in the Justice Department, but the Justice Department got rolled in those 4 years, basically, or close to it.
No, this is a hard topic. The Supreme Court chose to, grant absolute immunity and derail the January 6th case. And that was a surprise, I think, to Garland. I think he felt there was going to be a trial in the summer of 2024.
That was already way into it. I mean,
he lost a year.
You have a chapter about a lost year.
Yeah.
Do you think that he could have followed all of his principles and still gotten to a point earlier where there could have
Yes.
been a trial?
Yes.
Yes.
And that by losing that first year, it just made Trump had to sort of run out the clock for a final year before the election. And then he got a big help from the Supreme Court. And this is, again, this belief that Trump didn't commit any crimes on January 6th and that he shouldn't have been charged, which I'm just trying to share with you. That's what Mike Davis and to a certain extent, Justice Roberts and Justice Alito and the majority who, made that immunity decision believed that it was unfair that Trump was charged for January 6th and that it weakened the presidency.
Maybe you can't answer this for Garland, but for some of his people around him, perhaps. Do they realize that lost year cost the country or the possibility?
Well, one of the ironies is that now Garland and many people around him face being criminally investigated
Exactly.
by the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So the fact that they were so cautious and crossed every T and dotted every I makes them, not worried about that they can actually go to jail.
Right.
It's just amazing what's happening.
Now, all of this, even taking aside Trump, if that's possible, all of this is happening in the context of massive cultural changes in terms of how news is presented and how the public views politics. Would Nixon have survived in this culture today?
So this will sound partisan, and Tim Naftali is a Canadian and American historian. He said that the founders set up a system that was based on one thing, and then there was one thing, a quality that Richard Nixon had. And I'm just going to share this. And they said that the founders believed, and Richard Nixon had, a sense of shame. That the only way these norms and the kind of American system works is a people who a sense of shame. And Naftali feels that like there's never been, and again, this is unfair maybe to Trump, but that there's never been, a person who, will just, shame doesn't seem to impact them. Because and that's, he's sort of blown through every norm, and it just continues. But he just won the election too, so I can't, I'm not doing a good job answering this question.
No, you're incredibly cautious, but that's all right.
Well, so the presidents from Watergate on, 50 years, Republicans and Democrats, and you would know this better with all your work, they all assume that if they broke these norms, if they threatened to prosecute their opponents, if they attacked a special prosecutor, they'd pay an enormous political cost. They would be driven from office as, Nixon was.
Well, Clinton just meeting on the plane with his attorney general was a huge story.
Yes.
Right?
And so Trump
every
just
day.
blows through all those norms, attacks Robert Mueller and a bunch of left-leaning, and his political base, supports it. And the irony was that Mueller did like a fair report and actually, and roughly exonerated him from actively colluding with Russia. I believe in special counsels. This is, again, this idea of that you're going to trust someone to put their personal politics aside. Robert Hur, who came out with a report, and he's a sort of Republican lawyer, but about Biden's mishandling of classified documents. And Biden did keep, it was a much smaller number of classified documents. And Ken Delanian, who I mentioned earlier, he's our Justice Department reporter, got a transcript. This is when Biden was still in the race and before the debate, about, and Hur famously said that, he didn't prosecute because Biden seemed like a well-meaning older man. Right. And I got calls from the White House, we were going to run that story, that the transcript showed, and Biden got really mad and he said, yeah, they brought up Beau's death and I didn't. And that's not true. If you look at the transcript, and we had the transcript, Biden brought up Beau's death. And Biden was all over the place when Robert Hur interviewed him. So, Hur is like savaged by Democrats for saying he's a well-meaning older man with a memory issue. And that's partisanship. This hack special counsel, he's a Republican, he's trying to get a job in the Trump administration. Democrats did it too. So it's really hard. And we all saw with the debate that there was a memory issue. So it's...
So let's end with, maybe you'll be, optimistic about it. I'm not sure. Are there guardrails still there enough with the Supreme Court decision and everything else?
Yes. The president is absolutely immune from calling the attorney general and ordering him to investigate whoever he wants criminally. But then, as I said, you have to have a prosecutor and an FBI team that will actually carry out a baseless investigation. That if there is not, one of my brothers is a police officer. If there is not probable cause, they shouldn't carry out the investigation. So they can refuse at that level. You can have prosecutors and FBI agents say, I'm not carrying this out. You can have a judge, when the case is actually brought to the judge, say, there is not probable cause here, I'm throwing this case out. And then it's up to a jury, because in this country still, you can only be convicted by a jury of your peers. And I kind of, on the Trump-Russia investigation, so what might happen is, if you guys remember, John Durham was the special counsel that was appointed to look into all this nefarious stuff that Comey did and Brennan did and hyping, found basically nothing. He brought 2 people to trial for lying, and they were acquitted by Washington juries. So there's a hope that maybe Mike Davis, when he gets in there and actually looks at what Jack Smith had done, he sees that there isn't this giant conspiracy. and doesn't, and I heard that John Durham was like an honorable guy who like didn't find crimes. He felt it was wrong that the Russia investigation happened, but he wasn't going to, bring cases against innocent people. So I'm hoping that will work. There are checks on our system. There are people in the Trump transition team who want to make sure things don't go too far off the rails. And then there's also, and this is more, the social media, partisan cable TV culture we live in that rewards extremism. It gets a lot of audience. Smearing each other, being tribal. The New York Times called MSNBC comfort food for liberals. Fox making it's more exciting than me and this kind of book. But that's what scares me most.
I disagree with that. This book is exciting. It's all fact, but when you read it, even if you're not going to say it, it makes a pretty strong case.
The politicizing
of the Justice Department.
The politicizing of, where tyranny begins.
Yeah.
You see it in authoritarian regimes. The first thing you do is start jailing your opponents and discrediting them. And so again, Trump supporters and maybe Trump himself thinks that's what's happening to him. It's just scary to me, the different realities, and it goes all the way back to time I spent when I got arrested and I'll end on this.
Yes.
I got arrested by the Bosnian Serbs, and they said, and I was at a mass grave, and the town of Srebrenica, and 7,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed. And the Serbs said, you're being paid by OPEC to make up, we're Christians, you're a Christian, why are you telling these stories about, Muslims? And the Serbs had told themselves this story that they were defending Europe from a Muslim invasion. And then when I was 15 years later, held by the Taliban, I went to do an interview in 7 months. They all believed that 9/11 was staged by the CIA and the Mossad to create an excuse to send American troops to Muslim countries, and they believed that U.S. troops in Afghanistan were forcibly converting Muslims to Christianity and making Afghan women work as prostitutes on U.S. military bases. So those experiences overseas led me to believe that the danger, human nature, the biggest danger for humans isn't that we sit around and are sadistic and know we're doing something wrong. It's more the human ability to kind of rationalize and tell ourselves that we are defending our democracy, our faith, our family, our way of life, and getting caught up in these conspiracy theories where it leads, people to actually use violence. I don't think we're there here, but I'm very frustrated with social media and hate and the tribalism, and it's very, very dangerous. And I'm not going to do that, and I'm probably wasting my time. But I want to go talk to the people who worked in the Trump Justice Department and understand how they saw things. But it scares me to death, the exaggeration, the vitriol, and it makes you really famous on these extremes. I think there's a whole bunch of Americans in the middle who aren't as...
I agree with that,
Yeah.
but I also think that what you're doing is searching for the truth and for fact, and that's the most important thing you can do. And thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
May I ask you a question? Will there be a presidential election in 2028?
I think so, yeah. I do. I'm optimistic, and I think there will be, yes. I think there will be. And the fact, and in a way, Trump winning, it's, the system worked. Or it blows a lot of, it says people counted the votes and he won for the Trump supporters who felt that he was constantly being blocked. I don't know if that makes any, it doesn't, again, I believe Biden won in 2020. I believe George W. Bush, all these, I do believe, as a journalist, I've been in all these places and you just don't find these unbelievably complex, conspiracies being carried out in the government They're just not that competent. So,
Let's-
let's hope the public servants hold.
Yes. Okay.
Oh.
If you have time, I didn't want to go
Sorry,
too far.
thank you all.
I'd be happy to read a couple. I'm trying to, this is three
Did my
questions.
daughter send this one in?
No. Do you think the 14th Amendment needs to be changed?
The 14th is like the competency of the president?
Who asked that question?
I don't, so wait, and that's the members of the cabinet can, that's the 25th. What's the 14th? I'm like, this is embarrassing.
Why did you ask it? Yeah,
The January 6th.
yeah.
Oh, that you can't run. I think that, I know this isn't a good, I mean, this people who are, I understand people's understandable fear of Trump in January 6th. It's much healthier for us to resolve our differences through an election than through, blocking someone from being on a ballot. I know that people who are very afraid of Trump, that's not very comforting. But I just do think that one of the lessons of these prosecutions of Trump was that it didn't, people just will, Jeff Sessions, sorry, one last quote, Jeff Sessions, who Trump destroyed his career, he showed me, here's the seat I sat in the Senate for 20 years. Here's my cabinet seat when I was Attorney General in his house, in his living room in Mobile, Alabama. But I'm just saying our tribalism won't be solved by a judge or a court ruling. Maybe it'll be solved by an election. But I asked Sessions about what he thought of Trump after he had just so destroyed him politically. And then Sessions himself said, well, Trump did cross some lines on January 6th, but he thought that calling it an insurrection was an exaggeration. And he said that, the idea that Trump was a serious threat to democracy was overstated. And he said that Trump was a blunderbuss. So I think it's important to win battles politically, to win elections. There's an election in 2 years.
Yeah, you're not the only one who feels that. I mean, Jocelyn Benson, who's the Secretary of State of Michigan and has devoted her whole life to voting rights, said that in Michigan they had to resolve it through voting and she wasn't going to put him off the ballot because of that.
And it's getting out there, politicking, running for office. That's how the being apathetic and thinking it all doesn't matter, whatever side you're on, that's the worst thing. That's the worst thing. And again, that's why the National Security Unit and NBC News will fairly and factually, cover a second Trump administration. We're not going to get away from the basics.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Dave. It wasn't your daughter's question. I didn't even understand the other two. So.
No, that was why I wasn't sure what the amendment.